Case 1. Miguel Ricart, Spain. November 13th, 1992, Alcàsser, Valencia, Spain. In the autumn of 1992, Spain experienced a tragedy that would fundamentally alter its criminal justice system and haunt the national consciousness for generations. Two teenage girls disappeared on their way to a local festival, triggering one of the most extensive missing persons investigations in Spanish history. When the horrifying truth finally surfaced, it exposed a crime so calculated and merciless that it would lead to sweeping legal reforms across the entire nation. Miguel Ricart Tarragona entered the world on June 19, 1971, in the Valencia region of Spain. Growing up in Catalonia, a working-class community with limited prospects, Miguel's early years were characterized by financial hardship and family dysfunction. Throughout his adolescence, troubling patterns emerged. Academic struggles, confrontations with authority, and involvement in petty criminal activity marked his teenage years. By his early 20s, local law enforcement knew him as someone who associated with questionable company. Nothing in this trajectory, however, suggested the capacity for the monstrous act that would unfold in November 1992. The catalyst of Miguel's descent into infamy was his association with Antonio Angles, an older, charismatic figure whose dangerous nature lay hidden beneath surface charm. Angles possessed a magnetic quality that drew vulnerable individuals into his orbit, making them feel part of something significant. Miguel, adrift and impressionable, became a devoted follower. He sought Angles' approval and gradually found himself willing to participate in acts he might never have contemplated independently. By late 1992, Angles began articulating darker impulses, fantasies involving violence, domination, an act that would make them feel invincible. Miguel listened. When Angles transitioned from fantasy to planning, Miguel failed to distance himself. On the evening of November 13, 1992, 14-year-old Miriam Garcia Iborra and 15-year-old Antonia Gomez Rodriguez left their homes in Alcàsser, a small community near Valencia. They were excited, dressed for celebration, anticipating an evening of music and friendship at a local festival. They never arrived. Somewhere along their route, the teenagers encountered Antonio Angles and Miguel Ricart. The exact words used to convince the girls to enter a vehicle with two unfamiliar men remain unclear, but within moments, what should have been a joyful evening transformed into an inescapable nightmare. Angles and Ricart transported the girls to an abandoned structure in a desolate area called La Romana. There, the two men held the teenagers captive, subjecting them to hours of sexual brutality and torture. Miguel Ricart was present throughout. While Angles orchestrated the assault, Ricart was an active, willing participant. The girls pleaded for mercy, begged to be released, promised silence, but encountered none. When the men finished their assault, they made the calculated decision to eliminate any possibility of identification. They executed both teenagers, shooting them and abandoning their bodies in the abandoned building before igniting it in an attempt to obliterate evidence. For 75 agonizing days, Miriam and Antonia were simply missing. Their families maintained hope, organized massive search operations, and made tearful television appeals for information. The case captivated Spain, with thousands of volunteers joining search parties. As weeks became months with no trace of the girls, hope gradually withered. On January 27, 1993, a beekeeper made a devastating discovery at La Romana. The revelation sent shockwaves throughout Spain. When forensic analysis revealed the extent of what had been inflicted upon the girls, the nation erupted in rage and grief. The investigation accelerated rapidly. Evidence at the scene pointed to Antonio Angles and Miguel Ricart. Angles vanished before authorities could apprehend him, initiating one of Spain's most intensive manhunts. Miguel Ricart, however, was located and arrested within days. Initially, Ricart denied any involvement. As the forensic evidence became irrefutable, he began to cooperate. He confessed to being present during the attacks and admitted participating in the violence, though he attempted to minimize his culpability by placing primary blame on Angles. He portrayed himself as someone coerced, someone afraid to refuse, someone swept up in events beyond his control. The evidence contradicted this narrative. This wasn't spontaneous violence or coercion. This was calculated, sustained brutality lasting hours, and Miguel Ricart had been an active participant throughout. Miguel Ricart's trial commenced in 1994 and became a national obsession. Daily, angry crowds surrounded the courthouse demanding justice and maximum punishment. Inside, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, forensic connections to the crime scene, testimony establishing his relationship with Angles, and his own confession detailing that night's events. The defense argued that Ricart had been under Angles' influence, a follower rather than a leader, deserving consideration for his cooperation. The brutality of the crime and the suffering inflicted on two innocent teenagers, however, left minimal room for sympathy. In September 1994, Miguel Ricart was convicted of kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. He received a sentence of 170 years in prison, the maximum penalty available under Spanish law at that time. The families of Miriam and Antonio wept in the courtroom, finally achieving some measure of justice, though nothing could restore their daughters. One frustrating element remained unresolved. Antonio Angles was never found. Despite an international manhunt and reported sightings across Europe and beyond, he remained a fugitive. Some believe he died shortly after fleeing, possibly drowning while attempting to stow away on a ship. Others believe he remains alive somewhere, living under a false identity. To this day, he has never been captured or held accountable. Miguel Ricart spent subsequent decades in Spanish prisons. His case catalyzed significant legal reforms in Spain. The horrific nature of the Alcàsser murders led to changes in how violent crimes were prosecuted and sentenced, particularly crimes against children. The case also sparked national conversations about victim rights, criminal justice, and missing persons investigations. Ricart became one of Spain's most reviled prisoners, requiring protective custody due to threats from other inmates. Prison reports described him as someone struggling with the reality of life imprisonment, oscillating between expressing remorse and making excuses. In 2013, after serving 19 years, Miguel Ricart became eligible for parole under Spanish law. Despite his original 170-year sentence, the possibility of his release sparked immediate public outrage. The families of Miriam and Antonia fought desperately to keep him imprisoned, arguing he remained dangerous and that releasing him will betray their daughter's memory. Nevertheless, in 2013, Miguel Ricart was released on parole with strict conditions including GPS monitoring and movement restrictions. His release triggered fury. Thousands protested in the streets. The victims' families felt betrayed by a justice system that allowed someone involved in such horrific crimes to walk free after less than 20 years. Today, Miguel Ricart lives as a free man somewhere in Spain, his exact whereabouts known only to authorities. He maintains a low profile and has never provided a detailed public account beyond his trial testimony. He remains one of the most despised figures in Spanish criminal history. The Alcàsser case fundamentally transformed Spain. It exposed vulnerabilities in missing persons investigations, led to significant legal reforms, and created lasting cultural trauma that persists more than 3 decades later. Miriam Garcia Iborra and Antonia Gomez Rodriguez were just 14 and 15 years old when their lives were stolen. They were going to a party. They should have returned home safely. Instead, they encountered 2 men who saw them not as human beings, but as victims to be exploited and destroyed. Miguel Ricart's story forces confrontation with an uncomfortable truth about accomplices in violent crime. He wasn't the mastermind. He didn't plan the attack. But he was there. He participated. He had opportunities to stop it, to summon help, to release those girls. He chose not to. He chose to be part of something monstrous. While Antonio Angles may have been the primary perpetrator, Miguel Ricart's willing participation made him equally responsible for the deaths of 2 innocent girls. Case 2, Wayne Lowe, United States. December 14, 1992, Great Barrington, Massachusetts. There exists a particular horror associated with school violence, the violation of spaces meant to be safe, the targeting of young people whose lives have barely begun, and the randomness that leaves survivors wondering why they were spared. On December 14, 1992, Simon's Rock College, a small liberal arts institution in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, became the site of one of the earliest modern school shootings in America. At the center stood an 18-year-old student named Wayne Lowe, whose meticulously planned attack would leave 2 people dead, 4 wounded, and an entire community asking a question that still haunts them. Could this have been prevented? Wayne Lowe was born in 1974 in Taiwan and immigrated to the United States with his family during his childhood. They settled in Montana, where his parents worked diligently to provide opportunities for their children. By all accounts, Wayne was a brilliant student, intelligent, disciplined, and academically gifted. He excelled academically, played classical music, and appeared destined for success. His family was devoutly Christian, and Wayne himself was deeply religious, regularly attending church services and Bible study groups. Friends described him as quiet and reserved, though not unfriendly. He kept largely to himself, but when he did interact with others, he was polite and respectful. There were no obvious warning signs, no history of violence, no criminal record. On paper, he was precisely the kind of student any college would proudly admit. In 1992, Wayne Lowe enrolled at Simon's Rock College, a unique institution allowing students to begin college after 10th or 11th grade, catering to academically advanced teenagers. It was a small, close-knit campus with fewer than 400 students, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Wayne arrived for the fall semester and initially appeared to integrate well. He was studious, maintained his coursework, and participated in campus activities. As weeks progressed, however, something began to shift. Classmates started noticing behavioral changes. He became more withdrawn, more isolated. He spent hours alone in his dormitory room. When he did speak to others, his conversations often took strange turns. He talked about guns, about violence, about feeling disconnected from the world around him. Some students found it unsettling. A few even mentioned it to campus staff. But in the early 1990s, the kind of threat assessment protocols that exist today simply didn't exist. Concerns were noted, but no serious action was taken. What nobody fully understood was that Wayne Lowe was planning something. In the weeks leading to December 14th, he had become obsessed with firearms. He ordered a semi-automatic rifle through the mail, a Chinese-made SKS that he purchased legally and had shipped directly to a local gun shop. When the package arrived on campus, it was intercepted by college security. The return address indicated it came from a firearms dealer, and staff became concerned. They contacted Wayne's mother, who seemed surprised and worried. They spoke with Wayne himself, who claimed it was just a gift for a friend, nothing to worry about. Campus administrators debated what action to take. Some felt they should confiscate the package and investigate further. Others worried about violating his privacy, overreacting. In the end, they made a decision that would haunt them forever. They released the package to him. Within hours, Wayne Lowe retrieved his rifle, purchased ammunition from a local sporting goods store, and returned to campus armed and ready. On the evening of December 14th, 1992, Wayne Lowe put his plan into motion. He loaded his rifle, filled his pockets with ammunition, and walked out of his dormitory with singular purpose. His first target was a library, but finding it relatively empty, he moved outside and began walking across campus, firing at anyone he encountered. His first victim was, Nakunin says, a 34-year-old professor and beloved faculty member who was simply walking to his car. Wayne shot him multiple times. Nakunin fell to the ground and died within minutes. Students nearby heard the shots and began running, screaming, trying to understand what were happening. Wayne continued walking, calm and methodical, firing at anyone in his path. He shot and wounded several students, including Teresa Beavers, who was struck in the neck and critically injured. Campus security guard Richard Goulet heard the commotion and rushed toward the sound of gunfire. He was unarmed. Simon's Rock security officers didn't carry weapons, but he ran toward danger anyway, trying to protect students. Wayne Lowe shot him multiple times. Richard collapsed and died at the scene, giving his life trying to stop the attack. By now, police had been called and sirens were approaching. Wayne continued firing, wounding more students, until he finally ran out of ammunition. When officers arrived and confronted him, he surrendered without resistance. The entire attack had lasted less than 15 minutes, but it had shattered an entire community. In the immediate aftermath, questions came fast and furious. How did this happen? Why did this happen? And most painfully, could it have been stopped? Investigators discovered that Wayne had left behind writings, journals, and notes revealing a deeply disturbed young man who felt alienated, angry, and convinced that violence was justified. He wrote about wanting to punish the world, about feeling superior to those around him, about seeing himself as an agent of some twisted form of justice. There were references to his religious beliefs, distorted and warped into something dark. He seemed to believe he was carrying out a righteous act, that those he killed deserved their fate. It was a kind of thinking that would become tragically familiar in the years to come as school shootings became more frequent and warning signs more recognizable. But in 1992, this was still relatively new territory. Wayne Lowe was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder, multiple counts of attempted murder, and various weapons offenses. His trial began in 1993 and became a media spectacle. The defense argued that Wayne was suffering from mental illness, that he was delusional and not fully responsible for his actions. Psychiatric experts testified about his psychological state, describing a young man disconnected from reality and unable to distinguish right from wrong. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture. They presented evidence of careful planning, deliberate actions, and clear awareness of what he was doing. They argued that Wayne Lowe knew exactly what he was doing, that he had made a choice, and that he needed to be held accountable. The jury sided with the prosecution. Wayne Lowe was found guilty on all counts. In September 1993, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, in delivering the sentence, spoke directly to the devastation Wayne had caused. The lives ended, the future stolen, the community torn apart. He described the crime as calculated and cruel, and made it clear that Wayne Lowe would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But the story takes another disturbing turn. In the years since his conviction, Wayne Lowe has become something that many find deeply unsettling. He has become remorseful, or at least he claims to be. He has written letters to victims' families apologizing for his actions and expressing regret. He has participated in interviews and documentaries, speaking about his crime with what appears to be genuine sorrow. He has said that he was wrong, that he was confused, that he wishes he could undo what he did. Some people believe him. They see a young man who made a catastrophic mistake and has spent decades reckoning with it. Others see it as manipulation, a calculated attempt to appear sympathetic, to rewrite his own narrative. The families of Nakunin Says and Richard Goulet have expressed mixed feelings. Some have chosen to forgive, finding peace and letting go of anger. Others remain convinced that Wayne Lowe is exactly what he was on that December night, a cold-blooded killer who destroyed their lives and doesn't deserve sympathy. Wayne Lowe remains incarcerated today, serving his life sentence in a Massachusetts state prison. He will never be released. He has no possibility of parole. And yet his case continues to raise uncomfortable questions about culpability, about mental illness, about the systems that failed to identify and stop him before tragedy struck. Simon's Rock College, now Bard College at Simon's Rock, has worked hard to heal, to honor the victims, and to ensure that what happened in 1992 never happens again. But the scars remain, visible in the memorials on campus, in the stories shared by survivors, and in the absence of 2 people who should still be alive. Wayne Lowe's story is a reminder that school violence didn't begin with Columbine or Parkland or any of the other names we've come to know. It's been happening for decades, each tragedy leaving behind the same devastation, the same questions, and the same desperate plea, never again. Case 3, Bernadette McNeely, United Kingdom. December 1992, Manchester, England. There are crimes that shock us because of their brutality. There are crimes that disturb us because of their senselessness. And then there are crimes like the torture and murder of 16-year-old Suzanne Capper in December 1992 that force us to confront something even more terrifying, the capacity for ordinary people to commit acts of unimaginable cruelty, not in a moment of rage or passion, but slowly, deliberately, over days of sustained torture. At the center of this nightmare was Bernadette McNeely, a woman whose sadistic treatment of a vulnerable teenager would become one of the most horrifying cases in British criminal history. Bernadette McNeely was born in 1965 in Manchester, England, into a working-class family in one of the city's rougher neighborhoods. Her childhood was marked by instability, poverty, and dysfunction. She grew up in an environment where violence was commonplace, where abuse was normalized, and where empathy seemed to be in short supply. By her 20s, Bernadette had developed a reputation in her neighborhood as someone you didn't cross, loud, aggressive, and quick to violence. She had a string of failed relationships, struggled to maintain employment, and seemed to bounce from one chaotic living situation to another. She had children, but was reportedly an inconsistent and neglectful mother, often leaving them in the care of others while she went out drinking or causing trouble. By 1992, Bernadette was living in a rundown house at 97 Langworthy Road in Mostown, Manchester, with her boyfriend and several other people who drifted in and out. The house had become something of a gathering place for local troublemakers, a place where drugs were used, where stolen goods were fenced, and where violence simmered just beneath the surface. Neighbors described it as a problem house, the kind of place where screams and shouting were so common that people eventually stopped paying attention. It was in this toxic environment that 16-year-old Suzanne Capper found herself in December 1992, and it would be the last place she'd ever know. Suzanne was a vulnerable teenager from a troubled background. She'd had a difficult childhood, bounced between family members and care situations, and was desperate for acceptance and belonging. She'd become acquainted with the people at 97, Langworthy Road, and, despite the dysfunction, saw them as something like friends. She would visit the house, sometimes stay over, trying to fit in with a group that saw her not as a friend, but as a target. Bernadette McNeely, in particular, seemed to view Suzanne with contempt. She mocked her, belittled her, and gradually began subjecting her to increasingly cruel treatment. What started as verbal abuse and humiliation would, over the course of several days in December 1992, escalate into torture that defies comprehension. On December 7, 1992, Suzanne Capper was effectively taken prisoner in the house on Langworthy Road. What followed over the next 7 days was a sustained campaign of torture so brutal that even experienced detectives would later struggle to describe it without breaking down. Bernadette McNeely was a primary orchestrator and most enthusiastic participant in the abuse. Suzanne was stripped, tied to a bed, and subjected to relentless physical and psychological torture. Bernadette burned her with cigarettes, beat her with various objects, and cut her with knives. She injected Suzanne with substances to keep her weak and disoriented. She pulled out clumps of Suzanne's hair, laughing while doing it. But the physical torture was only part of the horror. Bernadette subjected Suzanne to psychological torment that was equally cruel. She forced Suzanne to listen to recordings of demonic chanting and horror soundtracks at full volume for hours on end, creating an atmosphere of complete terror. She made Suzanne repeat phrases humiliating herself. She taunted her, told her no one cared about her, that she was worthless, that no one would miss her when she was gone. And perhaps most disturbing of all, Bernadette seemed to enjoy it. Witnesses who were in the house during this time would later testify that Bernadette appeared gleeful, that she laughed while inflicting pain, that she seemed energized by Suzanne's suffering. Other people were present in the house during Suzanne's captivity. Some participated in the abuse, others watched passively, but no one helped her. No one called the police. No one intervened. One intervened. The torture continued day after day, with Bernadette leading the assault. She poured petrol over parts of Suzanne's body and threatened to set her alight. She stubbed cigarettes out on her skin dozens of times. She beat her so severely that Suzanne's face became almost unrecognizable. And through it all, Suzanne begged for mercy, begged to be let go, promised she wouldn't tell anyone. But Bernadette had no intention of letting her go. By December 14th, Suzanne was barely alive. Her body was covered in burns, cuts, and bruises. She had lost teeth from the beatings. She was emaciated, dehydrated, and in shock. And that's when Bernadette and the others decided they needed to get rid of her. They forced Suzanne, who could barely walk, into a car and drove her to a remote area near Rumley. They dragged her to a patch of waste ground, doused her in petrol, and set her on fire. Then they drove away, leaving her to burn to death. But Suzanne Capper didn't die immediately. Despite burns covering 90% of her body, despite everything she had endured, she somehow managed to put out the flames and drag herself to the side of a road. A passing motorist found her in the early morning hours and called for help. When paramedics arrived, they were horrified by what they saw. Suzanne was barely recognizable as human. Her skin was charred, her body was broken, and she should have been dead. But she was conscious, and she was able to speak. In the ambulance and later at the hospital, Suzanne told the authorities what had happened. She named her attackers. She described the torture. She gave them the address of the house on Langworthy Road. Police immediately launched an investigation, and within hours had arrested Bernadette McNeely and 5 others who had been involved in the abuse. Suzanne held on for 4 more days, fighting for life with incredible strength. But on December 18, 1992, her body finally gave out. She was 16 years old. The investigation revealed the full extent of the horror that had taken place in that house. Police found evidence of the torture, bloodstains, recording equipment used to terrorize Suzanne, restraints, and instruments used to inflict pain. Witnesses came forward describing what they had seen and heard, and Bernadette McNeely's role as a primary torturer became undeniable. She had orchestrated the abuse, participated enthusiastically, and shown no remorse even after her arrest. Bernadette and 5 others were charged with murder and various torture-related offenses. The trial began in 1993 and shocked the nation. The details that emerged were so horrific that the judge warned the jury about the disturbing nature of the evidence they would hear. Bernadette's defense attempted to argue that she had been under the influence of drugs, that she had mental health issues, that others had been equally responsible. But the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses testified that Bernadette had been the driving force behind the torture, that she had seemed to take pleasure in Suzanne's suffering, and that she had shown no mercy even when Suzanne begged for her life. In November 1993, Bernadette McNeely was found guilty of murder. The judge, in sentencing, described the crime as one of the most horrific he had ever encountered. He spoke of the sustained cruelty, the complete lack of humanity, and the suffering inflicted on a vulnerable young girl who had trusted the wrong people. Bernadette McNeely was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. The other participants received varying sentences based on their level of involvement, but Bernadette, as a ringleader, received the harshest punishment. She remained in prison for over 2 decades, serving time in various facilities across England. Reports from prison officials describe her as difficult, manipulative, and showing limited progress in rehabilitation programs. She maintained that she had been blamed unfairly, that others had been equally responsible, and that her role had been exaggerated. She showed little genuine remorse for what had happened to Suzanne Capper. In 2015, after serving 21 years behind bars, Bernadette McNeely was released on parole. The decision sparked immediate outrage. Suzanne's family was devastated, feeling that 21 years was nowhere near enough for someone who had tortured a teenager to death over 7 days. Victim advocacy groups condemned the parole board's decision, and the community that remembered Suzanne's case were horrified that her killer was walking free. Today, Bernadette McNeely lives under a new identity in an undisclosed location, subject to lifelong parole conditions. She has been given anonymity to protect her from vigilante justice, a decision that further angered those who believe she should face public accountability for her crimes. We don't know what her life looks like now, whether she has relationships, employment, or people who know about her past. She has never given a public interview or offered a detailed explanation for her actions beyond what she said during legal proceedings. The murder of Suzanne Capper remains one of the most disturbing cases in British criminal history, not just because of the brutality, but because of what it reveals about human nature. Bernadette McNeely wasn't a stranger who abducted Suzanne off the street. She was someone Suzanne knew, someone Suzanne had trusted. And over 7 days, Bernadette systematically destroyed that trust along with Suzanne's body. She didn't kill in a moment of rage. She didn't act out of desperation. She tortured a child slowly, methodically, and with apparent enjoyment. Suzanne Capper died in agony, betrayed by people she thought were friends, failed by a system that should have protected her. And Bernadette McNeely, the woman who orchestrated her suffering, served 21 years and walked free. That's a reality that still haunts everyone who knows this case, because sometimes the monsters don't stay locked away. Sometimes they get second chances that their victims never had. Case 4, Karla Homolka, Canada, 1990 to 1993, Ontario, Canada. In the history of Canadian crime, few names inspire as much rage, confusion, and debate as Karla Homolka. She's been called many things: a victim, a manipulator, a monster, a survivor. The truth, as it often is in these cases, is far more complicated and far more disturbing than any single label can capture. What makes her story so chilling isn't just what she did, but how she managed to walk away from it with a sentence that many believe was far too lenient. This is a story of a woman who helped commit unspeakable crimes, then convinced the justice system she deserved a second chance. Karla Leanne Homolka was born on May 4, 1970, in Port Credit, Ontario, into what appeared to be a stable, loving family. She was the eldest of 3 daughters born to Carl and Dorothy Homolka, working-class parents who provided a comfortable suburban upbringing. Friends and teachers described young Karla as bright, outgoing, and popular. She did well in school, had a close-knit group of friends, and seemed to have a relatively normal childhood. She worked part-time at a pet store, loved animals, and talked about becoming a veterinary assistant. There were no red flags, no warning signs, nothing that suggested she would one day become involved in some of the most horrific crimes Canada had ever seen. She was, by all accounts, just an ordinary teenage girl living an ordinary life. That all changed in October 1987 when 17-year-old Carla met 23-year-old Paul Bernardo at a hotel restaurant in Scarborough. The attraction was immediate and intense. Bernardo was handsome, confident, and charming, everything Carla found exciting. Within hours of meeting, they were intimate. Within weeks, they were inseparable. And within months, their relationship had taken on a dark and troubling dynamic. Bernardo was controlling and dominant, and Carla, rather than pushing back, seemed to embrace it. She began molding herself into whatever he wanted her to be. Friends noticed a change. She became more secretive, more distant, more focused on pleasing Paul at the expense of everything else. But to the outside world, they looked like the perfect couple, young, attractive, and deeply in love. What nobody knew was that Paul Bernardo was already living a double life. By the time he met Carla, he had already committed multiple brutal assaults as a so-called Scarborough rapist, a serial predator who had been terrorizing the Toronto area since May 1987. Carla would later claim she had no knowledge of these crimes during the early years of their relationship. But as time went on, she became not just aware of his violent tendencies, she became an active participant in them. And it started in the most unthinkable way possible, with her own sister. In December 1990, Carla made a decision that would forever cement her place in criminal infamy. She wanted to give Paul a twisted gift. She wanted to give him her 15-year-old sister, Tammy. Carla worked at an animal clinic and had access to sedatives used on pets. She stole a bottle of halothane, a powerful anesthetic, and brought it home. On the night of December 23rd, after a family Christmas party, Carla and Paul drugged Tammy's drinks. Once the teenager was unconscious, they assaulted her while videotaping the attack. But something went horribly wrong. Tammy began to vomit and choke. Instead of calling for help immediately, Carla and Paul panicked, tried to clean up evidence, and only then called emergency services. By the time paramedics arrived, Tammy was dead. Carla told investigators that her sister had simply gotten drunk and choked. The death was ruled accidental. Carla attended the funeral, comforted her grieving parents, and played the role of devastated sister. She got away with it. And that was only the beginning. Emboldened by their success in evading suspicion, Carla and Paul escalated. On June 14th, 1991, 14-year-old Leslie Murphy was abducted after being locked out of her house late at night. She was taken to the couple's home in St. Catharines, Ontario, where she was held captive, assaulted repeatedly over 24 hours, and murdered. Carla was there for all of it. She participated, she filmed, and according to evidence that would later emerge, she showed no hesitation. Leslie's body was dismembered, encased in concrete blocks, and dumped in a lake. 2 weeks later, the remains were discovered. The community was horrified. Police launched a massive investigation, but Carla and Paul continued their lives as if nothing had happened. They even got married on June 29th, 1991, in a lavish ceremony attended by family and friends. It was a fairy tale wedding, complete with a horse-drawn carriage, held just 2 weeks after they had murdered a child. Less than a year later, in April 1992, 15-year-old Kristen French was kidnapped in broad daylight from a church parking lot. Witnesses saw a young blonde woman asking Kristen for directions. That woman was Carla Homolka. Once Kristen approached the car, Paul forced her inside. She was taken to their home, held captive for 3 days, and subjected to horrific abuse, all of it recorded on video. When they were finished, Paul strangled her, and her body was dumped in a ditch where it was found 2 weeks later. Once again, Carla was present for everything. Once again, she participated. And once again, she showed no outward signs of guilt or remorse. But cracks in the relationship were starting to show. Paul had become increasingly violent toward Carla herself, beating her on multiple occasions. In January 1993, after a particularly savage beating that left her with severe injuries, including black eyes and broken ribs, Carla left Paul and moved in with relatives. She was hospitalized, and when police saw her injuries, they began asking questions. Afraid of being implicated in the murders and realizing Paul might turn on her, Carla made a calculated decision. She contacted a lawyer and began negotiating a deal with prosecutors. She would testify against Paul Bernardo in exchange for a reduced sentence. Here's where the story takes a turn that still enrages people to this day. Prosecutors, desperate to secure conviction against Bernardo and unaware of the full extent of Carla's involvement, agreed to a plea deal. In May 1993, Carla Homolka pleaded guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter and received a sentence of 12 years in prison. The deal was done, signed, and sealed. But then, months later, police discovered something that changed everything. Videotapes hidden in the couple's home that showed Carla wasn't just a reluctant participant or a battered woman forced to go along. She was an active, willing participant who appeared to enjoy what she was doing. The tapes contradicted almost everything she had told prosecutors. But it was too late. The deal couldn't be undone. Bernardo's trial in 1995 revealed the horrifying truth, and public outrage over Carla's sentence reached a fever pitch. The media dubbed it the deal with the devil. Advocacy groups, victims' families, and legal experts condemned the decision. But Carla Homolka served her 12 years quietly in prison, largely shielded from the general population due to safety concerns. She participated in therapy, obtained a degree, and by all accounts, behaved as a model prisoner. On July 4, 2005, Carla Homolka was released from prison after serving her full sentence. And here's where her story becomes even more controversial. She didn't fade into obscurity. She moved to the Caribbean, then later to Montreal, where she remarried and had 3 children. She changed her name, but her identity was eventually discovered by the media. In 2017, it was revealed that she was volunteering at her children's school, a fact that sparked outrage and fear among parents. Journalists have occasionally tracked her down, and each time the same questions resurface. Has she changed? Does she feel remorse? Is she a threat? Carla Homolka has never done a full public interview or offered a detailed explanation for her actions beyond what she said during legal proceedings. Some psychologists believe she was a victim of severe domestic abuse who was coerced into participating. Others believe she was a willing partner who manipulated the system to escape justice. The truth may lie somewhere in between, or it may be darker than either explanation suggests. Today, Carla Homolka lives as a free woman under a new identity, raising her children and living a quiet life. Meanwhile, the families of Tammy Homolka, Leslie Mahaffey, and Kristen French continue to live with the pain of their losses. Paul Bernardo remains in prison, denied parole repeatedly, and the public continues to grapple with an uncomfortable question. Did justice truly prevail? Or did Carla Homolka commit the perfect crime, not just the murders themselves, but the ultimate escape from accountability? Case 5, Lori Tackett, United States. January 11, 1992, Madison, Indiana. If Melinda Loveless was a spark that ignited the horror of January 11, 1992, then Lori Tackett was the gasoline that made it burn. In the brutal murder of 12-year-old Shanda Scherer, Tackett wasn't just a follower going along with someone else's plan. She was an active, enthusiastic participant whose own darkness matched, and perhaps even exceeded, Melinda's rage. While Melinda's motive was jealousy, Lori seemed driven by something far more unsettling. She appeared to enjoy it. This is a story of a teenage girl whose fascination with death and violence would culminate in one of the most horrific crimes Indiana had ever seen. Lori Tackett was born on October 5, 1974, in Madison, Indiana, into what looked from the outside like a stable middle-class family. Her father was a factory worker, her mother a homemaker, and they lived in a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other. But inside the Tackett household, things were far from normal. Lori's childhood was marked by instability and dysfunction. Her parents' marriage was troubled, marked by frequent arguments and periods of separation. Lori herself struggled with feelings of not fitting in, of being different from other kids her age. She was intelligent, even gifted in some ways, but she channeled that intelligence into dark places. By her early teens, Lori had developed an obsession with death, the occult, and violence. She read books about serial killers, drew disturbing images in her notebooks, and talked openly about wanting to hurt people. Friends found her fascinating and frightening in equal measure. In high school, Lori cultivated a deliberately dark persona. She dressed in black, listened to heavy metal music, and claimed to be involved in satanic rituals. though whether she actually participated in such things or simply enjoyed the shock value is unclear. She had few close friends, but those she did described her as magnetic, intense, and unpredictable. She would swing between being charming and witty to cold and cruel without warning. Teachers noticed her intelligence but were concerned by her preoccupation with morbid subjects. She wrote essays about death and violence, drew graphic images of torture, and seemed to revel in making others uncomfortable. But in the early 1990s, before Columbine and before schools had comprehensive threat assessment protocols, these warning signs were noted but not seriously addressed. Laurie was seen as a troubled teen, maybe a bit strange, but not necessarily dangerous. In 1991, Laurie became friends with Melinda Loveless. It was a toxic pairing from the start. Two deeply troubled girls who fed off each other's darkness. Where Melinda was explosive and emotional, Laurie was cold and calculating. Where Melinda acted out of jealousy and rage, Laurie seemed motivated by something more disturbing. Curiosity about what it would feel like to hurt someone. When Melinda began talking about her hatred for 12-year-old Shanda Scherer, claiming that Shanda had come between her and her girlfriend Amanda, Laurie didn't just listen. She encouraged it. She suggested ways to hurt Shanda, talked about how they could get away with it, and seemed genuinely excited by the prospect. For Laurie, this wasn't about jealousy or revenge. This was an opportunity to act out the violent fantasies she'd been nurturing for years. On the night of January 11th, 1992, when Melinda, Laurie, Hope Rippey, and Tony Lawrence drove to Shanda Scherer's house and convinced her parents to let her leave with them, Laurie was calm, almost cheerful. Once Shanda was in the car and they drove to a remote location, the violence began. Melinda attacked first, stabbing Shanda with a knife while the girl screamed and begged for her life. But it was Laurie who escalated things to an even more horrific level. Witnesses would later testify that Laurie participated enthusiastically in the torture, that she beat Shanda with a tire iron, that she strangled her, and that she seemed to be enjoying herself throughout. At one point, according to testimony, Laurie suggested they should make Shanda strip so they could humiliate her before killing her. This wasn't just about eliminating someone Melinda was jealous of. Laurie was turning it into her own twisted form of entertainment. The torture went on for hours. They drove around with Shanda in the trunk, stopping periodically to beat her again, to pour cleaning chemicals on her wounds, to inflict more pain. At one point, they stopped at a gas station to buy drinks and snacks, laughing and joking while Shanda lay bleeding and barely conscious just feet away. Laurie was reportedly the one who suggested burning Shanda's body to destroy evidence. When they finally drove to a remote field in the early morning hours, pulled Shanda from the trunk, doused her with gasoline, and set her on fire, Laurie watched with what witnesses described as fascination. Some testimony suggested that Shanda was still alive, though barely, when the fire was lit. The girls left her there to burn and drove away. They stopped at McDonald's for breakfast, where Laurie reportedly joked about what they'd done, making light of the murder as if it were nothing more significant than a prank. When Shanda's charred remains were discovered the next morning, the investigation moved swiftly. Hope Rippey and Tony Lawrence, overcome with guilt and horror, cooperated with police almost immediately. Their testimony painted a devastating picture of the night's events, and both girls pointed to Melinda and Laurie as the primary instigators. When police arrested Laurie Tackett, she showed remarkably little emotion. She was calm, almost bored, as detectives questioned her. She admitted her role in the crime with chilling matter-of-factness, describing the torture and murder in graphic detail without any visible signs of remorse. When asked why she did it, she offered no coherent explanation beyond saying, "It seemed like a good idea at the time." Psychologists who evaluated her were disturbed by what they found: a complete lack of empathy, an inability to understand the gravity of what she'd done, and what appeared to be genuine enjoyment in recounting the violence. All four girls were charged as adults with murder, and their trials captivated the nation. The prosecution presented Laurie Tackett as every bit as culpable as Melinda Loveless, if not more so, due to the level of violence she personally inflicted and the apparent pleasure she took in it. The defense attempted to argue that Laurie was mentally ill, that her fascination with violence was a symptom of deeper psychological problems, and that she'd been influenced by Melinda. But the evidence was overwhelming. In 1993, Laurie Tackett was convicted of murder, criminal confinement, and arson. She was sentenced to 60 years in prison, the same sentence Melinda Loveless received. The judge, in delivering the sentence, spoke about the incomprehensible cruelty of the crime and the need to protect society from someone capable of such violence. Lori showed no reaction. She was 17 years old and would spend the next several decades behind bars. But prison, it seems, changed Lori Tackett, or at least she says it did. Over the years, she participated in extensive counseling and psychological treatment. She earned her GED, took college courses, and became involved in prison ministry programs. She expressed remorse in letters to Shanda's family, though they were never acknowledged or accepted. Psychologists who worked with her noted significant progress in her ability to understand and process emotions, to feel empathy, and to comprehend the magnitude of what she'd done. Whether this transformation was genuine or simply a calculated effort to improve her chances at parole is something people still debate. In 2018, after serving 26 years in prison, Lori Tackett was released on parole. The decision was met with immediate outrage. Shanda Scherer's family was devastated, particularly her mother, Jock Vaught, who had fought for years to keep both Melinda and Lori behind bars. Victim advocacy groups condemned the parole board's decision, arguing that the brutality of the crime warranted a life sentence. And the community of Madison, Indiana, was once again forced to confront the horror of what had happened all those years ago. Today, Lori Tackett lives under strict parole conditions, required to check in regularly with authorities and prohibited from contacting Shanda's family or the other girls involved in the crime. She has kept an extremely low profile, avoiding media attention and living quietly in an undisclosed location. She has never given a major interview or offered a detailed public explanation for her actions beyond what she said during legal proceedings. The question that haunts this case is the same one that haunts so many cases of juvenile violence. Can someone who committed such unspeakable acts as a teenager be truly rehabilitated? Lori Tackett was 17 when she participated in the torture and murder of a 12-year-old child. She didn't just go along with someone else's plan. She actively contributed to the horror, and by all accounts, she enjoyed it. Does spending 26 years in prison erase that? Does participating in therapy and expressing remorse make up for what was done? These are questions without easy answers, questions that force us to confront the limits of forgiveness, the possibility of redemption, and the nature of justice itself. Shanda Scherer died in terror and agony at the age of 12, her life stolen by people she considered friends. And while Lori Tackett walks free today, Shanda's family continues to live with the pain of her absence every single day. That's the reality that no amount of rehabilitation can change. Case 6, Melinda Loveless, United States. January 11th, 1992, Madison, Indiana. Some crimes are so brutal, so senseless, so completely devoid of humanity that they force us to confront the darkest possibilities of human nature. And when those crimes are committed by children, not hardened adults, but teenagers who should still be worrying about homework and weekend plans, the horror becomes almost incomprehensible. On January 11th, 1992, in Madison, Indiana, a 12-year-old girl named Shanda Scherer was tortured and murdered by 4 teenage girls in a crime so vicious that it shocked even seasoned investigators. At the center of it all was 17-year-old Melinda Loveless, whose jealousy and rage would lead to one of the most disturbing cases of juvenile violence in American history. Melinda Loveless was born on October 28, 1975, in New Albany, Indiana, into a troubled home that seemed destined to produce dysfunction. Her father was reportedly abusive, both physically and emotionally, creating an atmosphere of fear and instability. Her mother struggled to protect her children and keep the family together, but the damage was already done. Melinda grew up angry, volatile, and starving for control in a life where she'd had none. By her early teens, she was already exhibiting troubling behavior, explosive temper, difficulty maintaining relationships, and an intensity that made people uncomfortable. She struggled in school, not because she lacked intelligence, but because she couldn't seem to connect with others in any meaningful way. Friends would later describe her as magnetic but dangerous, the kind of person who could draw you in and then turn on you without warning. In her mid-teens, Melinda became involved in a relationship with a girl named Amanda Heverin. It was intense, possessive, and ultimately toxic. Melinda was obsessed with Amanda, and that obsession quickly turned controlling. She wanted to know where Amanda was at all times, who she was talking to, what she was doing. And when Amanda began pulling away, when she started spending time with other people, Melinda's jealousy reached a boiling point. Enter Shanda Scherer, a 12-year-old girl who attended the same school and had recently become friends with Amanda. Shanda was young, sweet, and completely unaware that she had become the target of Melinda's rage. In Melinda's twisted mind, Shanda had stolen Amanda's attention. She had to be eliminated. In the days leading up to January 11th, Melinda began planning. She recruited 3 other girls to help her: Lori Tackett, Hope Rippey, and Toni Lawrence. Each had their own reasons for going along. Some were looking for excitement. Some were afraid to say no. And some, like Lori Tackett, were dealing with their own darkness. Together, they hatched a plan to lure Shanda out of her house and teach her a lesson. What started as a plan to scare a 12-year-old would escalate into something far more monstrous. On the night of January 11th, 1992, the 4 girls drove to Shanda Scherer's home. They knocked on the door and told Shanda's parents a story about needing her help with something, convincing them to let Shanda leave with them. Once Shanda was in the car, the night descended into nightmare. They drove her to a remote area, and that's when the violence began. Melinda attacked Shanda with a knife, stabbing her repeatedly while the others watched or participated. Shanda begged for her life, pleaded to be let go, promised she wouldn't tell anyone. But Melinda was beyond reason. The attack continued for hours. They beat her with a tire iron, strangled her, and tortured her in ways that are almost too horrific to describe. At various points throughout the night, they stopped to get food, to clean themselves up, to discuss what to do next, or while Shanda lay bleeding and barely conscious in the trunk of the car. Eventually, they drove to a remote field, pulled Shanda's body from the trunk, poured gasoline over her, and set her on fire. Some reports suggest that Shanda was still alive when they did this, though barely. The girls watched as the flame consumed her, then drove away, leaving her body to burn. They stopped at a fast food restaurant on the way home, ate breakfast, and talked about what they'd done as if it were nothing more significant than skipping class. The next morning, a hunter discovered Shanda's charred remains in the field. The discovery sent shock waves through the small community of Madison, Indiana. Who could do something like this to a child? The investigation moved quickly. Within days, police had identified the 4 girls involved. Hope Rippey and Toni Lawrence, the youngest and least involved, began cooperating almost immediately, their guilt and horror evident. Lori Tackett remained largely silent, cold and detached, and Melinda Lovelace showed little emotion at all. When questioned by detectives, she was matter-of-fact, almost casual in describing what had happened. She admitted her role, acknowledged the violence, but offered no real explanation beyond jealousy and anger. There was no remorse, no breakdown, no moment of recognition that she had done something unforgivable. It was as if she simply didn't understand, or didn't care, that she had taken a life. All 4 girls were charged as adults with murder, kidnapping, and other offenses. The trials became a media sensation, with a nation watching in horror as the details emerged. The prosecution painted Melinda Lovelace as a ringleader, the driving force behind the crime, the one whose jealousy had ignited the entire tragedy. The defense argued that she was a product of her abusive upbringing, a damaged child who had never learned how to process emotions in a healthy way. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the brutality of the crime left little room for sympathy. In 1993, Melinda Lovelace was convicted of murder, criminal confinement, and arson. She was sentenced to 60 years in prison, one of the harshest sentences ever handed down to a juvenile offender in Indiana at that time. But here's where Melinda Lovelace's story takes an unexpected turn. Over the years in prison, something changed, or at least she says it did. She participated in counseling, earned her GED, took college courses, and became involved in prison programs focused on rehabilitation. She wrote letters expressing remorse, spoke about the pain she had caused, and claimed to have found faith and forgiveness. Psychologists who evaluated her noted significant emotional growth and a genuine understanding of the gravity of her actions. In 2019, after serving 26 years behind bars, Melinda Lovelace was released on parole. The decision sparked immediate and intense controversy. Shanda Scherer's family was devastated, outraged that the person who had brutally murdered their daughter was walking free. Victim advocacy groups condemned the parole board's decision, and the community of Madison, Indiana, was divided. Some believed in rehabilitation and second chances. Others believed that some crimes are simply unforgivable. Today, Melinda Lovelace lives under supervision, subject to strict parole conditions. She has kept a low profile, avoided media attention, and by all accounts has tried to build a quiet life far removed from her past. She has never done a major interview or offered a detailed public explanation for her actions beyond what she said during legal proceedings. Meanwhile, Shanda Shearer's mother, Jock Vaught, has become an advocate for victims' rights and has spoken publicly about the pain of seeing her daughter's killer released. Jock has described the ongoing trauma, the sleepless nights, and the feeling that justice was never truly served. Melinda Lovelace's case forces us to grapple with questions that have no easy answers. Can someone who committed such unspeakable violence as a teenager be truly rehabilitated? Does a person who tortured and murdered a 12-year-old child deserve a second chance? And at what point does punishment become justice, and when does it simply become revenge? These are the questions that continue to haunt everyone touched by this case. Shanda Shearer never got a second chance. She never got to grow up, fall in love, have a family, or live the life that was stolen from her on a cold January night in 1992. And for many people, that's the only answer that matters. Case 7, Paul Bernardo, Canada. 1987 to 1993, Ontario, Canada. Some criminals become infamous because of a single horrific act. Others earn their place in the darkest corners of criminal history through a pattern of escalating violence that reveals something truly terrifying about human nature. Paul Bernardo falls into the latter category. He didn't just commit crimes. He perfected them, refined them, and documented them with a chilling level of pride. And for years, he did it all while wearing the mask of a charming, successful young man that nobody suspected. Paul Kenneth Bernardo was born on August 27, 1964, in Scarborough, Ontario, a suburb of Toronto. To the outside world, his childhood looked relatively normal. His father worked as an accountant, his mother was a homemaker, and the family lived in a comfortable middle-class neighborhood. But behind the curtains of that suburban home, darkness festered. Bernardo's mother was reportedly cold and emotionally abusive, while his father had a violent temper and a disturbing history that included allegations of inappropriate behavior. When Bernardo was 16, his mother revealed to him during an argument that the man he called father wasn't his biological parent. She'd had an affair, and Paul was a result. The revelation shattered whatever fragile sense of identity he constructed. Friends and acquaintances from his teenage years would later recall that something changed in Paul after that. He became more calculating, more manipulative, more focused on control. By his early 20s, Bernardo had transformed himself into exactly the kind of person people wanted to be around. He was handsome, well-dressed, and charismatic. He worked in accounting, drove a nice car, and seemed to have a bright future ahead of him. Women found him attractive. Men found him affable. He was a guy who could light up a room, tell a good joke, make everyone feel like they were his best friend. But underneath that polished exterior was something monstrous waiting to emerge. Starting in May 1987, a series of disturbing attacks began plaguing the Scarborough area. Young women were being targeted in the early morning hours as they walked home or waited at bus stops. The attacker would appear suddenly, overpower his victims, and commit brutal assaults before disappearing into the night. The media dubbed him the Scarborough Rapist, and the community was gripped with fear. Police launched a massive investigation, but the attacker was careful, methodical, and seemingly invisible. What nobody knew at the time was that Paul Bernardo, the friendly accountant with a winning smile, was responsible for at least 14 of these attacks. In October 1987, Bernardo met a 17-year-old girl named Carla Homolka at a hotel restaurant in Scarborough. She was blonde, petite, and working part-time while finishing high school. He was 23, confident, and immediately captivated by her. Within hours of meeting, they were intimate. Within weeks, they were inseparable. And within months, they had formed a bond that would become one of the most disturbing criminal partnerships in Canadian history. Carla was drawn to Bernardo's intensity and dominance. He, in turn, found in her someone who wouldn't just tolerate his darkest fantasies. She would participate in them. They fed off each other's dysfunction, pushing boundaries further and further until fantasy became reality and reality became a nightmare. On December 23, 1990, Carla's 15-year-old sister, Tammy, became their first murder victim. In what can only be described as an act of unspeakable evil, the couple drugged the teenager and assaulted her while videotaping the attack. Tammy choked on her own vomit and died in the early hours of Christmas Eve. When paramedics arrived, Bernardo and Homolka claimed she'd simply gotten drunk and choked. The death was initially ruled accidental. They had gotten away with murder, and that emboldened them to go further. In June 1991, 14-year-old Leslie Maffei was abducted after being locked out of her house late at night. She was held captive in Bernardo and Homolka's home in the town of St. Catharines, where she endured unimaginable horror over the course of 24 hours. Everything was recorded on video. When they were finished, Bernardo ended her life, dismembered her body using a circular saw, encased her remains in concrete, and dumped them in a nearby lake. 2 weeks later, portions of the concrete blocks washed ashore. The discovery sent shock waves through the region. A massive investigation was launched, but once again, Bernardo remained just out of reach. He and Carla even attended Leslie's funeral, watching from a distance as her grieving family laid her to rest. Less than a year later, in April 1992, 15-year-old Kristen French was kidnapped in broad daylight from a church parking lot. She was held captive for 3 days, subjected to repeated assaults, all meticulously filmed, before being murdered and dumped in a ditch. Her body was found 2 weeks later. The community was in a state of panic. Police were under enormous pressure to find the killer. And yet, Paul Bernardo still wasn't on their radar as a primary suspect. He'd been interviewed months earlier in connection with the Scarborough attacks after his name came up through a tip, and he'd even provided blood and hair samples. But due to a massive backlog in the forensic lab, those samples sat untested for over 2 years. While police waited for results, Bernardo continued to operate freely. The case finally broke open in early 1993, but not because of brilliant detective work. It was because the relationship between Bernardo and Homolka began to crumble. He'd become increasingly violent toward her, beating her severely on multiple occasions. In January 1993, after a particularly brutal assault that left her hospitalized with severe injuries, Carla moved out and went to stay with relatives. Afraid of being implicated in the murders and seeing an opportunity to save herself, she contacted a lawyer and began negotiating a deal with prosecutors. She would testify against Bernardo in exchange for a reduced sentence. Prosecutors, desperate to secure conviction and unaware of the full extent of her involvement, agreed. Carla Homolka received a plea deal of 12 years in prison in exchange for her testimony. It would later become one of the most controversial decisions in Canadian legal history. When police finally arrested Paul Bernardo on February 17, 1993, they found a treasure trove of evidence in his home, videotapes that documented his crimes in horrifying detail. The tapes left no doubt about his guilt. They also revealed that Carla Homolka had been far more involved than she'd initially claimed, but by then her deal was done. The tapes became the centerpiece of Bernardo's trial, which began in May 1995. The proceedings were heavily restricted due to the graphic nature of the evidence. But what emerged was a portrait of a man who had not only committed unspeakable acts, but had enjoyed them, filmed them, and watched them repeatedly. The jury deliberated for just 9 hours before returning a verdict. Guilty on all counts, including 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. But the story doesn't end there. In 1997, Bernardo was declared a dangerous offender, a designation that allows the court to keep him imprisoned indefinitely beyond his minimum sentence. He has applied for parole multiple times and been denied every time. As recently as 2023, his parole hearings have generated public outrage and media coverage, with victims' families and advocacy groups fighting to ensure he never walks free. He remains incarcerated in a maximum security facility, where he will likely spend the rest of his life. Paul Bernardo represents something that terrifies us on a fundamental level, the monster next door. He wasn't some obvious misfit lurking on society's fringes. He was the kind of person people liked, trusted, and invited into their lives. And that's what makes his story so deeply unsettling. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it smiles, shakes your hand, and waits for the perfect moment to strike.